If God exists, why isn't he more obvious? This is a question that many people ask, even those who believe in God. However, this type of thought has recently led some philosophers, most notably J Schellenberg, to construct an argument against God's existence. This has become known as the argument from Divine Hiddenness, and in this video I'm going to tell you what it says. The general idea is pretty simple to grasp and says that if God is all-loving, all-knowing and all-powerful, then he would make his existence more obvious. Why should we think this? Well, many theists, such as Christians, think that God is interested in having a relationship with his creatures, people like you and I. But if we're to have a relationship with God, then it seems as though we'd need to be aware that he exists, since it appears you can't have a relationship with something or someone you don't know about. So if God wants a relationship with all his creatures due to his loving nature, he should let them know that he exists, especially as he has both the knowledge and the power to do that. But as it seems that not everyone in the world does know that he exists, the proponents of the Divine Hiddenness Argument think that this gives us strong reasons for believing that he doesn't. Before we look in more detail at Schellenberg's argument, let me make one point that's important. The argument doesn't require that God should provide spectacular signs and miracles so that we come to know that he exists. Subtle things would do the job just as well, such as God providing everyone with a continual experiential awareness of his loving presence, or maybe shaping our minds in such a way that we detect all sorts of subtle traces of God acting in the world. How God lets us know that he exists, therefore, isn't that important. It's more that if God exists, he would make sure we all come to know that he exists in some way, unless we're deliberately trying to stop that. Here's a more detailed formulation of Schellenberg's argument. The first step is that a perfectly loving God would make sure that everyone could participate in a personal relationship with him at all times, unless they willfully choose not to. But in order to have a personal relationship with God, you need to believe that God exists. And so we should think that a loving God will always enable everyone to believe that he exists, unless they willfully choose not to have a relationship with him. But there are some people who aren't resisting a relationship with God, but don't think that he exists. That is, there are some people who fail to believe in God through no fault of their own. Yet given what we've said, if God existed, he wouldn't allow this to be the case, so we should conclude that a perfectly loving God doesn't exist. Before we think about some reasons for accepting Schellenberg's premises, let me say something about the structure of the argument. If you watched my previous video on the problem of evil, you might have already worked out that this is a logical or deductive version of the problem of hiddenness. So the argument says that there's something incompatible with God existing and his existence not being known by everyone who isn't willfully resisting a relationship with him. Because it's a logical version of the argument, the conclusion is very strong and says that God does not exist. But just like the problem of evil, the argument from hiddenness can come in different forms. So we could run an evidential form of the argument, a probabilistic comparison form of the argument, and an abductive form of the argument. Equally, we could run the argument in terms of the amount of hiddenness we see, the kind of hiddenness there is, and the distribution of hiddenness we find in the world, just as we could for the problem of evil. I'm not going to say anything more about these different ways of running the argument here, but I'll leave it for you to think more about how these different forms of argument might run. And let me give you a hint. If you haven't already done so, you'll be helped by watching my video on the problem of evil. So I think the first step in the argument is true, that a loving God would make sure that everyone could have a relationship with him as long as they weren't resisting this. Schellenberg's reason here is all to do with love. He thinks that once we reflect on what it means to be loving, we'll see that love requires that we desire to be close to the thing that we love. But if that's true, then a God who is perfectly loving would do everything in his infinite power to make sure that each of his creatures had the opportunity to be close to him. I should add that Schellenberg doesn't think that God would force us into a relationship with him, as after all that doesn't seem very loving, but just that God would make this offer known to each of us clearly. Schellenberg also offers some analogies to further back up this thought. For example, he asks us to imagine a child and his mum playing hide and seek in the woods, with the mum being the one who hides. Now suppose that the mum hides so well that the game goes on for hours and hours, and because of this, her child comes to wonder whether she's abandoned him. Schellenberg's point is that this isn't what a loving mum would do. She'd never willingly allow her child to be in serious doubt about whether she was there with him. But by analogy, Schellenberg thinks that if a perfectly loving God exists, he too would never leave the creatures he loves in any significant doubt about whether he exists. The big question here is obviously whether Schellenberg has the right view of the nature of love. This video isn't the place for laying out responses people have given to the argument, but note that if you think the nature of love is different from what Schellenberg says, then you might not find the argument very persuasive. Also, it's worth bearing in mind that we might be able to think of situations and analogies where we think it's perfectly loving for a parent or person to remain hidden, and in fact it's precisely because they are loving that they do so. I'm going to be cheeky here and not give you any examples. Instead, it's up to you to come up with some. So get your thinking caps on, it's good for you. In fact, maybe you could say that I'm being loving by keeping you in the dark about this, because by thinking about it on your own, you'll become a better thinker in the long run. Let's turn to the second step of the argument, which says that in order to have a personal relationship with God, then you need to know that he exists. This step Schellenberg spends less time defending, because he thinks it's obvious that you can't engage in a relationship with a person unless you believe that person exists. On the face of it, this does seem strange, but again, maybe this strangeness can be overcome. Once more, this isn't the time and place to properly question this, but here's some more thinking work for you. Can you think of instances where people thought they were communicating with a person, but they actually weren't? And if you can do that, can you think of possible cases in the reverse, where they thought they weren't communicating with a person, but they actually were? If you can do the latter, would this be enough to show that Schellenberg's premise is false? More thinking work for you to do. The final step of Schellenberg's argument is the one that says that there are people who don't believe in God, but it isn't their fault. These people are what Schellenberg calls non-resistant non-believers. They aren't resistant to belief in God, and yet they don't believe that God exists. The way Schellenberg defends this is by giving examples of people he thinks meet this criteria. One group are those who have lost their faith in God, but want it back, and so wouldn't God let them know that he exists? Another group are those who have grown up in a culture where they've never been exposed to the concept of God, and so it seems they aren't at fault for lacking belief in God. Finally, there are those people who think that God might exist, but having carefully and honestly weighed the evidence, conclude that he doesn't. And Schellenberg takes it that he himself belongs to this final category. A key question here is what we should think counts as resistance. This will be important since depending how we define it, it will be more or less easy to find people who count as non-resistant. Discussion of this will again have to wait for another time, but it's something else for you to think about. So this is a sketch of the way in which Schellenberg defends the premises of the argument, and if they're true, then the conclusion follows, namely that a loving God doesn't exist. Given this, if you want to block the argument, you need to reject one of the premises. Theists have provided different reasons for thinking that the argument doesn't work, and in a future video I'll talk about some of the responses that have been given. But what do you think of the argument? Do you find it persuasive? And if you had to pick a premise you thought was the weakest, which would it be and why? So I hope you found this video helpful on outlining the problem of divine hiddenness. If you have, then please give it a like, and if you don't want to miss out on any more content, then please subscribe.